and also he's not reading the actual verbal submission, so he can join us when he gets here.
That's fine. Well, welcome to our hearing. I was just going to read out the acronym, the HBDWGJC, also known as the Hawke's Bay Drinking Water Governance Joint Committee. Lovely to have you with us, and we'll pass over to you to present your submission. We've pre-read your original submission, so I'll pass it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you. Ngā mihi nui. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name's Garth Cowie. I'm the independent chair of both the Hawke's Bay Drinking Water Governance Committee and also the Hawke's Bay Drinking Water Working Group. With me today is Craig Thu on my right. He's the Group Asset Manager for Hastings District Council, and Liz Lambert on my left, former Group Manager Regulation for the Hawke's Bay Regional Council. Dr Nick Jones, from the Hawke's Bay Medical Officer of Health, will be joining us shortly, and I know we're starting early, so he'll be here hopefully for questions as they arise at the end. Our submission is number 119, and we take it that you have read that submission.
Yes, that's correct.
Our submission was around the provisions of safe drinking water posed in Plan Change 9, including specific source protection provisions, as well as more general objectives and policies as they may relate to an impact on drinking water. This is the specific remit of the Joint Governance Committee. We did not submit on any other parts of the Plan Change 9 outside the scope. This presentation today is to comment on the recommendations put forward in the Section 42A Officer's report in respect of those points of our submission and further submissions, and to be available to answer questions from the panel.
I just want to, this isn't necessarily a specific question related to evidence, but when you're just saying the Section 42A report, you're meaning and the addendum report?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
Thank you.
The Board of Inquiry into the Havelock North contamination event made some fundamental recommendations about drinking water safety and articulated the 6 principles of safe drinking water in New Zealand. The Board reinforced the need for greater collaboration across agencies responsible for the provision of safe drinking water, and established both the Joint Governance Committee and the Joint Working Group to work across a range of issues and focus on information and knowledge sharing. One of the tasks of the committee and the working group were invited to work on by TANC, a stakeholder group, was the development of source protection drinking water provisions for Plan Change 9. It is from this perspective of having worked through the various alternatives, our submission was prepared. The 6 principles of safe drinking water articulated by the board are repeated here, and I will go through them. Principle 1, a high standard of care must be embraced. Unsafe drinking water can cause illness, injury or death on a large scale. All those involved in supplying drinking water must therefore embrace a high standard of care. Vigilance, diligence and competence are minimum requirements, and complacency has no part. Principle 2, protection of source water is of paramount importance. The protection of the source water drinking water provides the first and most significant barrier against drinking water contamination and illness. It is of paramount importance that risks to sources of drinking water are understood, managed and addressed appropriately. Principle 3, manage multiple barriers against contamination. Any drinking water system must have and continue to maintain robust multi-barrier levels or barriers against contamination appropriate to the level of potential contamination. No single barrier is effective against all sources of contamination, and accordingly any barrier can fail at any time. Principle 4, change precedes contamination. Contamination is almost always preceded by some form of change, and change must never be ignored. Change of any kind should be monitored for and responded to with due diligence. Principle 5, suppliers must own the safety of drinking water. Drinking water suppliers must maintain a personal sense of responsibility and dedication to providing consumers with safe drinking water. Knowledgeable, experienced, committed and responsive personnel provide the best assurance of safe drinking water. Principle 6, apply a preventative risk management approach. A preventative risk management approach provides the best protection against waterborne illness. Once contamination is detected, illness may have already occurred. This requires systematic assessment of risks throughout the drinking water supply from source to tap, identification of the ways these risks can be managed, and control measures implemented to ensure that management is occurring properly. Adequate monitoring of performance of each barrier is essential. These principles form the basis of the work undertaken by the Governance Committee and the Working Group at the request of the Tank Stakeholder Group to formulate the source protection provisions for inclusion in Plan Change 9. The basic premise of the framework delivered to the Tank Stakeholder Group is that there is an acceptable level of risk in the management of source protection, acknowledging that there will never be zero risk. The key outcome sought by the Source Protection Zone provisions is to ensure that there is a greater understanding and awareness of activities that are occurring in the zone and be able to consider how those activities are undertaken and monitored. The framework is based on the regulation of activities within mapped source protection zones. It is with this in mind that our submission for the most part supports the Tank plan change provisions. There are several areas we wish to comment on further as a result of the Section 42A report and ongoing developments at central government level. Plan change provisions more specifically. We acknowledge that many of our submission points have been accepted in full or accepted in part with acceptable reasoning for why they may have been accepted or not accepted in full. We request that the hearings panel adopts the officer's recommendations for these points. Specifically, we agree with the officer's recommendations on our following submissions: 119.1 to 119.10 and 119.12 to 119.22. Further, we note that the Hastings District Council submission and expert evidence by Hastings District Council and Napier City Council sought amendments to the notified Plan Change 9 to achieve alignment with the provisions put forward by the Joint Working Group. The Section 42A Addendum Report accepted the amendments sought by Hastings District Council and Napier City Councils. Specifically, these support the inclusion of the combined outputs of both numeric and analytical modelling for the Hastings Urban Bore Supply Protection Zones. This is consistent with advice obtained through a peer review by GNS. I confirm that the amendments sought by Hastings District Council and Napier City Council regarding the source protection provisions are acceptable to the Joint Committee. Source protection zones which meet the peer review process can be consistent with the adoption of the precautionary principle of the RMA and the prudent and preventative risk management approach, which is one of the fundamental principles of safe drinking water as determined by the government inquiry. There are two matters we wish to comment on further: the impact on the proposed provisions of changes to legislation and regulation at a national level, and the development of and potential changes to the source protection zone maps. On my left is Nick Jones, Dr. Nick Jones, Medical Officer of Health. So,
welcome.
in the matter of changes to legislation and regulation, the situation is complex, fast changing, and by no means finalised. At the time of preparing our submission to Plan Change 9, we were awaiting royal assent of the Water Services Regulator Bill, the release of the Water Services Bill, and the review of the National Environmental Standard for the protection of sources of drinking water. Our submission is premised in part on the ability for the hearings panel to respond to national direction as part of its decision-making on Plan Change 9, and our submission was designed to provide you with the scope to do this. While your ability to do this has not changed, we are collectively not much further ahead in terms of certainty than we were at the time of lodging our submission. What do we know now is that the Water Services Regulator Bill has passed into law and Te Mata Arawai has been established. The Health Select Committee has heard submissions to the Water Services Bill and has delayed its reporting back to Parliament, effectively delaying the implementation of the bill until the last quarter of this year. Once passed, this puts into place the new drinking water regulatory framework, including Te Mata Arawai's becoming the drinking water regulator, and obligations on water suppliers and local authorities to identify and assess risks to drinking water. Once passed, the Water Services Bill introduces Section 104G under the RMA, which requires consent authorities, when making decisions on resource consent applications, to have regard to the effects of activities on registered drinking water sources, and also the risks of the proposed activities as they may be defined in a source water risk management plan. Section 104G of the RMA explicitly links those risk management plans under the Water Services legislation, or proposed Water Services legislation, to consent decisions are under the RMA. The review of the NES for drinking water is programmed to include amendments to enable better and quicker management of risks to source water in RMA decisions. To the best of our knowledge, these amendments will be consulted on in the second half of 2021 and gazetted, most probably as amended, NES early in 2022. In our submission on to Plan Change 9, submission point 11923, we sought the alignment of the definition of registered drinking water supplier in the plan with that in the Water Services legislation as it was proposed, on the assumption that the latter would be clarified by now. As this is not the case, we request that the hearings panel takes into account the latest information available to it on this definition at the time of making your decisions. Mapping. In relation to two remaining submission points, which is 119.11 and 119.24, these relate to the inclusion or not of mapped source protection zones within the planning maps issued as part of Plan Change 9. The Water Services Bill, as proposed, prescribes the need for drinking water suppliers to have in place a drinking water safety plan, part of which must be a source water risk management plan. The latter must identify any hazards that relate to the source water, including emerging and potential hazards, assess any risks that are associated with those hazards, identify how those risks will be managed, controlled, monitored, or eliminated as part of the drinking water safety plan, and have regard to any values identified by local authorities under the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management that relate to the freshwater body that the supplier uses as a source of drinking water supply. It is our understanding that, subject to government approval, the review of the National Environmental Standard for Drinking Water will include a requirement to identify source water risk management areas, replacing the up-gradient and upstream definitions in the current NES. With respect to surface water sources, upstream areas are relatively easily identified. With respect to groundwater sources, the current NES defines upstream as being up-gradient of the abstraction point. Defining the spatial extent of the up-gradient area can be extremely complex and require a detailed understanding of the groundwater system, including interactions with surface water, other groundwater abstraction regimes. Up-gradient also excludes groundwater which has the potential to be extracted for drinking water purposes, e.g. down-gradient groundwater, which are part of a drawdown area for groundwater abstraction. The key technical guidance document for the development of source protection zones in New Zealand is the GNS 2014 report, Capture Zone Guidelines for New Zealand. The range of techniques described in the guidelines is summarised for you in the attached document. Just to simply say, if you don't have any evidence to go on, there's a simple calculation, the desktop review. Then at the higher end, you have the analytical models, the AEMs, and then at the top of the tree is the numeric models. In general, I think the numeric models have about 15 parameters, and the analytical only 12, and obviously the lower ones have none. A significant amount of work has been undertaken by the Hastings District Council, Napier City Council, and the Hawke's Bay Regional Council to define the spatial extent of source protection zones, risk management areas, for the respective drinking water sources for Hastings and Napier urban supplies, all of which are groundwater abstractions. We support Table 3, Schedule 35, the methodology for determining source protection, as it recognises the complexity of source protection zone identification should be relative to the population size as risk increases and greater accuracy is required. As submission supports the provisions in the Notified Plan Change 9, allowing for source protection zones to be included or updated through the resource consent process as new activities occur. This also meant that the source protection zones were not a formal part of the regional resource management plan, but would be identified on GIS layers. The rationale for this is to recognise the need for an effective and responsive planning tool to incorporate the new information around risks as soon as possible. Our concern is that a plan change can take a number of years to become operative. This Tank 9 a case in point. We note that the Hawke's Bay Regional Council's 3D aquifer modelling project using SkyTM technology is underway and will provide a much greater understanding of the Hiratonga Plains aquifer and as well as other aquifers within the region. This has potential to change how risk is understood and managed, including the size and extent of source protection zones. In the Section 42A report, the officers have recommended that source protection zone maps be included as part of the plan rather than being added or amended through the resource consent process. While we understand the reasoning for this around regulatory certainty, we remain concerned in regards to ensuring that the plan can be agile to changes in information and knowledge on source water and the public health risk considerations. Our suggestion to the panel is that existing source protection zones be included in the planning maps, but that future zones be included in the GIS layer sitting outside the plan for consideration by the Regional Council in all relevant consent applications. Over time, these could be included in future plan changes. As with the methodology of determining the source protection areas, we are of the view that the reviewed NES for drinking water is likely to address the manner in which source protection zones are incorporated into the planning framework. The proposed amendments are scheduled to be considered by Cabinet in June and July this year, so that with other matters covered in this verbal submission, we request that you take into account the latest information available to you on this issue at the time of making your decisions. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you, and I have a number of colleagues that are more than happy to answer your questions.
We'll open up for questions. Rhoda, do you have any questions?
Not offhand straight away, but I might have some.
No, I don't have any. Dr. Rhoda?
Just a couple of questions from me, Mr. Cowie. And Mr. Thew sitting beside you is my cousins. Some of my few cousins are Thews, so I've got relatives all over the place today. Just two questions. The first one was the amended NES. I think at the moment source protection zones have to be defined for communities of over 501 people. Have I got that right?
It's the current NES.
Yeah. Yes, that's correct.
Is that number likely to change with the new NES? Do you know?
I'm happy to have a go. I think we will be advocating for that to be changed. You will see in the District Health Board submission.
Sorry, I can't hear you. You'll need to speak into the microphone a bit more. Thank you.
Intuitive.
How's that?
No.
No?
Just push the button.
You don't need to press anything, apparently.
Okay, we'll try that now. Thank you. I'm happy to have a go at answering that. I think we will be advocating for a change. We are aware of a number of communities whose numbers are smaller than 500, particularly small Māori communities who are currently not afforded the protections in the current NES, and so we would certainly be advocating for a lower number, but of course we don't know where that ultimately decision will lie. I think the other thing that's worth bearing in mind is that the new Water Services Bill itself defines, is it communities of greater than 50, or is it 25? 25. So effectively, by virtue of the fact that the Water Services Bill will apply to those communities, I would have thought then there will be some degree of alignment required with the new NES.
So would that mean in turn for a community like Bridge Pa, I'm not sure of the numbers on that a source protection area would need to be eventually defined for a community of that sort of size? Is that an example?
Yes, I think so, although, Haig, do you want to comment on that because they're connected to the Hastings supply?
So for that exact example, Bridge Pa is connected back to the Hastings urban supply, so the zone that we've proposed through would cover that. However, if we sort of take that example and think a little bit wider, the community of Morakakaho at the moment is a whole pile of self-supplies or potentially what will become registered supplies under the proposed Water Services Bill. So if there were a number of households that are connected into a single supply, then potentially moving forward that would need to have some form of source protection zone or source risk management plan. However, if it's only a small community, the level of sophistication and the scale and the level of draw would be a smaller zone than a large municipality.
Okay, so that could apply to a community like Omahau or that sort of size of community?
Correct, and you'll see in the Hastings maps themselves, the Omahu or Fernhill area is part of the Hastings District Council, one of our many supplies, and we've proposed a source protection zone there. That one's both a groundwater and a surface water zone, so it becomes quite large.
Okay, thank you. My second question is your paragraph 24. And you say, and it's the last two sentences, our suggestion to the panel is that existing maps be included in the planning maps, etc., etc. How would you envisage that would work exactly? If it's outside of the plan, it has no formal status?
I think what we're saying there is that where there are already maps that have been produced as part of Plan Change 9 and people have had the opportunity to submit on, that they actually should become a part of the actual plan itself. And it's only those that have not yet been identified that should be described in a GIS layer until such time as there's an opportunity to do a wider plan change again. So they're able to have some protection through the resource consent processing.
So to be clear, I think what we are saying is that the currently submitted maps from the District Council, we do support them being included.
Yes.
Thank you.
I don't think we have any further questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just to say that for those submitters who often say what they don't like in a plan, it's refreshing to see a submission that's identifying those matters that are strongly supported, which is just as important. So thank you very much for your submission.
Thank you.
We have Oleg Limited, Richard Riddell and Alistair and Joe Lawrence. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, so they're scheduled for 2:40.
So maybe
And we're only 20 past, we're 20 minutes
period of time. That's because this is official.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Nicola?
So our next submit is supposed to be with us at 2:40, so about 20 minutes away. We'll see if they arrive early, we can get them on earlier, otherwise we'll stick to our schedule. Thanks, everybody. So is it Mr. Riddell or Mr. Riddle?
That's me.
Mr. Riddell.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'll pass it over to you. So we've read your submission.
Right.
So happy to make a presentation if you want to focus on particular points.
Fantastic. That'd be great. Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to put some a face to our submission, I suppose. First of all, we support very much what the Regional Council's trying to do here and being collaborative, and many of the facets of what's proposed we are 100% behind. One of the things that we are, and you can probably see from the environmental perspective, we talked about what we've done with the Regional Council with a whole lot of riparian planting and with 1 billion trees. So we're very much in the whole process of making sure that our waterways and our farming operation fits in with the environment. So that's very much part of our ethos and where we want to be. So one of the things that we'd like to perhaps, if I go through the submissions and different things, is one is about stock water. Now, some of the criteria, albeit something maybe a little bit in the early stages, seems to be a little awry with what can actually happen on a pastoral farming dryland operation. Now, I'm not sure, I've said in my submission that Horizon Regional Council have done a lot of scientific work on stock water needs on a daily basis and a peak water basis. I have some data here, which I'm more than happy to present. I was told that there were 10 copies. And in here, it shows you what the daily average water
Nicola's
intake...
going to help you out with
Oh,
that.
sorry. Oh, well, there's one on the top, says Richard, I think.
I assume those are copies rather
They
than
are
a
copies.
copy, thank you.
Yeah, no, not that copy. So this is from a report that was commissioned by the Horizon Regional Council. It's all on the internet and easily found in 2007, and using Aqualink and a number of Lincoln University and various other parties on the daily needs of various stock classes. And here they've talked to the industry, and we've got sheep breeders, meat and wool, alpaca, deer industry, goat, equine, pork, poultry, etc. Things that perhaps have interest to me, specifically, and perhaps the pastoral farmer, is not so much that I don't think the Hawke's Bay Regional Council has the problems of Horizon with only 60 dairy farms in its district, but it's more to come down with the beef cattle thing, which is on page 10 of this report. Now, if we're being limited to so many cubes a day, and I have an 860 hectare property, we have an 860 hectare property with, in the spring and summer, we may have 1,200 head of cattle, adult cattle on the place, plus some lambs and plus some sheep. We will not be able to water them. And if I look at that, if you look at the drinking water estimates of beef cattle, and if I just take you through to, they've got many different classes there, but if you go over to page 11, they talk about the suggested range as a basis of determining a standard for mature beef cattle, herd replacement stock and bulls is a low end of 30 litres per head per day and a high end of 55 litres per head per day. Unfortunately, the high end is generally around the time when it's probably our lowest flows, which is in the summertime. And it goes through a number of classes here, and you'll see in sheep on page 13, they talk about 3 litres per head per day, and they talk about 4.5 litres per head per day. And they go on to many different classes with deer. And now all this is supported by a whole lot of different research done by many different parties, and I think it's pretty sound. From my agricultural degree from Lincoln College and the science that we did around these sort of things, it would seem to me that it's pretty realistic and pretty true. So what's proposed with regard to stock water take is not going to be viable for many pastoral organisations such as ours. And if that's the case, we're going to be very limited in what we can do. And I'm not sure if the Regional Council wants to have more pine trees, but it would have to go to pine trees. It will be the only thing that we could do, because I cannot physically give the water to my stock. So that's one of those issues, and I think stock water and residential water. So there's a really interesting thing here. If you go to page 24 under 3.2, it talks about stock water drinking allocations, and that talks about 300 litres per person per day for residents. So one individual will use 300 litres, where one bull in a peak day will use 55 litres. I'm talking about a bull that's 650 kgs. So I think we've got to get a happy balance here. And so I'm just asking you to give consideration to the scientific facts and look at coming up with something that's actually a solution for residential water and stock water, as opposed to this blanket thing that's proposed, because it won't work.
Sorry, Mr. Riddell, how many bulls would you carry at a maximum?
1,200
Thank you.
plus another 150 steers, plus 400 to 600 ewes, and there will be lambs on there at the time. Now, I'm not a large farming operation compared to many others, but if you just put that in half of what I have, or the average farm owner, he will be very limited in what he can do with regard to stock water. So that's one of our major concerns. One of the other concerns is perhaps, and it comes from Alistair's and Joe's presentation, is perhaps some of the ambiguous nature of some of the proposals. Now, I don't particularly want to be a pastoral farmer forever. I'd rather think that we could actually, with the use of water, alter from creating methane gas issues by putting water on from high flow events, taking some of that water, understanding the needs for flushing rivers, ecological things, but taking some of that water and converting it instead of into what I call low income earning farming operations, such as a pastoral farming operation. By putting a little bit of water on in times that we've been able to store, we may be able to not only increase the economic benefit of our property, but the whole of Hawke's Bay. And one of the things that I've looked at, and I've tried to look through in this whole report, is what is the economic impact, both positive and negative, on Hawke's Bay and the region. What's going to do for employment? We've got to sit there and think, well, let's spread this water in a manner that can be actually use land which, if it had a little bit of water being able to be put onto it, it doesn't have to be farming bulls. It might be farming squash. It might be farming soybeans. It might be buying something that is not providing such a carbon footprint. So we need to look at alternative uses, and some of the nitrogen and nitrate things there, I don't have a problem with controlling nitrogen. I have no problem with it, but let's put it into a context whereby people aren't limited by some directive that says I can't change my farming pattern. And when it comes down to what's come through is I have 860 hectares, 260 hectares of it, thank you to Regional Council, has just given me a water consent so I can put some water on it under the old rules. Now, it won't be farming bulls and things, but if I have to go and get a consent every time I want to do more than 10 hectares to change from a pastoral farming to putting into something else, the compliance cost is astronomical. So we've got to start talking about percentage of farmland as well as what you can change, rather than a grandparenting such as 10 hectares. So what I suppose we're really coming down to saying to you is that we applaud what you're doing. Fresh water, you know, our future generations being able to drink water out of streams, our kids swimming in it, water for everyone, flushing out the environment, looking after the iwi interests, looking after everyone's interests. But let's do it in a practical manner, and one that is perhaps set out in a way where it's not leaving to us to think, well, what does that mean? If I can only do 10 hectares, what's the point? And if I turn around and I look at the return of investment, so we're talking about getting a permit for 15 years. Now, if I'm going to ask you, each one of you, to invest $10 million in a farming operation to make it a little bit better, I'm not looking at a 15-year return, I'm looking at a 25-year return. And I'm asking that you look at that as well. If we're going to commit that capital to employ people, to make the economy better, 15 years is too much of a short time frame. If I look at a pastoral farming operation, basically you're looking at around in our district a 3 to 4% return. Now, if I can do a little change and invest money and, say, irrigate 200 hectares on and change it to orchards or growing soybeans or whatever it may be, and it's going to cost me a lot of money to do that, I'm not going to get that return in 10 years. I'm going to get it in 25 years. So we've got to start thinking like, can I say, the iwi, they think long term. We've got to start thinking long term. We've got to start thinking, well, if you're going to give me a permit to do something, don't ask me to come back every 4 or 5 years, because it's going to take me 3 years to build it. So let's make it a 25-year project, and let's make those permits there, and if nothing's happened in 5 years, come and take it off us. Make sure that we're doing something that is actually going to enhance. I think that's probably really what I wanted to say. I really wanted to say that please don't take the stock water away, put stupid limits on stock water and residential water, because you're going to change land use to something that I can't stand. Pine trees, all you have to do is go to South Island and see wilding pines taking over. My farm right now, I just cut out 450 pine trees out of our native bush block coming from seed line from woodlots. I don't want to have that. So, and I don't think your children want to see wilding pines going down the Narora River or the Tutakuri River. So let's just come back to being, let's allow the farmers to do what they're doing. But for goodness sake, if they are not doing what they should be doing, if the fresh water is not right, by all means, let's go and do some research. But also we endorse, should I say, catchment plans or things rather than a grandparenting. So if I look at our catchment, which is the Okawawa and the Mangatahi streams, all the farmers in there, we should be on one catchment plan and we should stick to it. And if something's wrong coming out of that particular catchment into the Narora River, you come and look at us and we should be fine. And we should be having instead of what I call a grandparenting situation, I'm going to bring it back into a work and safety issue. I have a farming operation, I have staff, I have a health and safety plan, and I have health and safety things that I have to report to work and safety on. Why don't we do the same for this? Instead of the compliance cost of me every year writing in a report to you, the number of extra people are going to be employed for the regional council to do it, why don't we sit down and have a process like what seems to work very well for health and safety? Put a plan together, we stick to that plan, and if that plan is awry, you come and we have to, you come and say, well, why, where's it going wrong? And then we have to do, to fix those problems. Rather than the other way around, every year us doing more compliance and you're going to fill in forms, it's going to go into a file to probably cover your backside from a national environment perspective. I understand that, but let's have something where it's a plan by catchment. We have to put a plan to you, you agree to it, and then if something goes awry, you then come and have a look like health and safety does. So here endeth the lesson by Richard Riddell. So hopefully it makes some sense to you.
Thank you, Mr. Riddell. Have you finished your presentation?
Yes, that's a combination of both. Really, I don't want to take your time.
Thank you. We just might open up if there's any questions.
So, Mr. Riddell, your current water supply for your stock, where is that coming from?
Comes from the Mangatahi stream.
So it's pumped out, is it?
It's pumped out.
Right.
And it also, I just bought this property 4 years ago, and it's an old historic farm. There are 6 houses on the place and a shearer's quarters, which we supply the water from that Mangatahi stream as well. So they store water as well, but that is part of what's been part of the history.
Have you estimated how much water you're taking out for your stock?
That's a very good question.
I did some numbers from
Yep.
your
Sure.
extension.
So if I'm talking in the peak of summer, I'm taking 55 litres a day, and I've got 1,000 kilo, I'm taking 55 cubes a day.
Oh, that's good. I got 54.9.
There you go. I like rounding up.
Yeah, so it's quite a lot. It's quite
It's a lot. And but that might only be for 3 weeks, 2 weeks, because a lot of those stock will be killed or sent to the works or things. So that's at the peak. But at 30 cubes or 10 cubes or 20 cubes, I'm going to have to change everything that I do.
And I didn't quite hear you say earlier, have you been granted a consent to take water?
Yes, thank you. I have, the regional
storage.
council has to store water for irrigation to change the way that we are apparently doing our flats. So we have 220 hectares, which is easily irrigatable land, and we want to change that from being pastoral into cropping or maybe even horticulture. Just to change the footprint. Now, we use FarmX as our farm scheme, so with the 55 hectares of new pines we planted, plus the 20 hectares that are there, plus 130 hectares of native bush regenerating in our gullies, which is all fenced off, plus another 14 hectares of bush we planted, we don't have a carbon footprint. We are negative. We are net sequesters of carbon as opposed to emitters, according to their program. Now, that's what we want to maintain.
And can I ask how much water were you granted?
It's over a flow, so I'm allowed to take up to 30% of the flow above a median high, subject to what the water flow is at the Fernhill Bridge and the Narora River, and subject to what the flow is at the Maraikataho River. So it's got to be above their medians, and it's a percentage of their flow as well.
Thank you. Yep, one more question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Riddell. I think you were referring at one stage to Table 1 and Schedule 29, is that correct?
I beg your pardon, mate.
Sorry, I need to speak into the microphone. You were referring to Table 1 and Schedule 29, is that correct?
That's right, yes.
So is that in the plan as notified or in the plan as amended, recommended to be amended by the officers?
That's a good question. I can't answer that. I have to go back and have a look at my notes on that.
Well, the old Table 1 simply had some leaching rates listed for
Yeah.
different activities.
Yeah.
The new Table 1 says effectively if you were changing, for instance, from sheep and beef to deer or goats, you wouldn't need, that's not a change of land use.
Right.
But if you were changing from, say, dry stock to vegetable growing, that is a change of land
That's right.
use.
Yep.
So I suspect from what you were saying, you were referring to the old Table 1.
That's right.
Okay, thank you very much.
I was particularly taken in your original evidence on your philosophical approach to farming.
Yes.
And in particular, I'm just trying to find where it is. Yeah, you sort of, you almost divided them into financial and non-financial objectives.
That's right.
And it's the non-financial objectives I just want to touch on.
Sure.
Which, I mean, you put environmental improvement and sustainability at the top, and then animal welfare and then people welfare. Can you just expand a bit on that?
Yeah, no, so, well, you know, we're in the business of, obviously, animals being healthy and, We're in the business of farming like most. I'd say 99.9% of farmers are very interested in the animal welfare and making sure all animals are in the peak of their health. We also believe that anyone that works or comes onto our property, that we treat them with respect, and their welfare is extremely important. Now, I'm not talking about just the manager and the people that come on. I'm talking about my spraying contractor. I'm talking about the truck driver that comes on. We see it as we are part of that community, and the more buy-in that they have, the more buy-in that they think that Olrig's a great place and what we're doing is great for the country.
And then you're again, part of your broader philosophy refers, I mean, it sort of touches on climate change
Yes.
and other extraneous, I suppose, or other things that
Or
impact
pandemics and things like that, yes.
on human life, including pandemics. Now, has this been a part of your experience in the past, or was
No,
that
I think
just out of the
it's just
COVID stuff, or
it's
what?
just COVID that's brought it into real reality to us. So when we were all locked down, this is when it comes to people welfare, I suppose. This is our neighbours. We were also in a very, very tough drought, and the communication between our neighbours at that time, when some farmers were in some very dire straits, it was about looking after the community. But what happens with COVID is, and I think what's happened where I've come from, I've been in Auckland for 35 years and finally come back to my land, is saying that perhaps the people in the city sometimes don't realise the sacrifice of what some people, these people doing on the land to provide not only jobs for many other people in the urban communities, but also for the country as a whole. So pandemics are really, I think what's thrown is agriculture, horticulture, viticulture, and just about anything in the primary sector has held this country in pretty good heart when you look at other parts of the world.
Now, your farm is essentially beef and sheep,
That's correct.
but you do some arable cropping as well, you say in your evidence,
Yes.
which I suspect accounts for the fact that you have a water consent application for 250 hectares in the pipeline at the moment.
That's right.
Am I reading that right?
Correct. So dryland barley and dryland peas was a complete failure, I must tell you. But it was one thing that we needed to do because we had some very old weedy pastures that we needed to do something with. So we decided we'd give it a go. But if we had water, it would have been successful. You know, and for peas, I probably only need to put the water on once, maybe even on just a little bit on another time. I'd probably 15 mils for that hectare over that time, and our crop would have been a lot higher. It would have been higher, would have been sustainable. So barley, I probably wouldn't put too much on barley, but I'm looking at other crops, such as carrot seed and various other things, which is a very large export earner that you can potentially do, or potentially might even grow apples up there. I'm not too sure. We're 200 metres above sea level.
And my last question is just around this issue of grandparenting
Yes,
that you were quite hot on in your
yes.
original evidence, and you've touched on it again today. I'd been interested in getting a clearer definition from you as to what you think grandparenting is.
Well, I suppose it's a little bit like you're getting a central directive, and you have to adhere to that, and it might be right for one district, but it mightn't be right for another. So if I talk about grandparenting and I'm talking about one grandchild is different to another grandchild, so therefore, why don't we look at different things to work for a different grandchild? And so I'm one of those different grandchildren which says, well, my catchment is totally different to someone on the other side of the Tank District. So what might work there may not work for us. So let's work in our little community, in our own little catchments, which is one of that part of our whānau, and that will work really well. That's what I say.
It's almost like saying horses for courses, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That was one of the interpretations I took from your comment. I wasn't quite sure whether that's what it was, because there are other ways of
That's right.
interpreting grandparenting. Now, your water source, you say, comes from one of the local rivers.
Two streams. There's the Okawawa stream which goes basically through the centre of our property, down one boundary, through the centre and down another boundary, and the Mangatahi stream comes in our western boundary probably for about 1.5 kilometres.
So do you have to store it, or are you doing it in troughs, or?
Yeah, we put it in troughs.
Oh, right, okay. And I just made a note under the Lawrence's
Yes.
submission, and one of them was, I think you've answered it, but I just want to get confirmation of this, reducing carbon emissions. Now, you did say that you've reduced carbon emissions almost totally.
That's right. That's been our goal. I think if you're thinking about marketing for New Zealand, and I watch this program, I'm not an advertiser for Netflix, but Kiss the Ground, which is one about our soils, looking after our soils, and I think New Zealand is leading the way compared to perhaps some of the, what's going on in many other parts of the world. So if we can farm sustainably without leaving too much of a carbon footprint, I think the ideology of the world today will see that our produce is actually going to have a little bit more value to it.
My question of the Lawrence's, and I'll put it to you
Yes.
under that same issue is how does or how would water management under this plan change, in your view, what does it need to do to help reach those targets, those carbon emission targets?
Right. So I think you have to have farming systems will need to change. Some of the farms, water will have to be part of it. So the ability for them to perhaps store water in flood events, so they can actually have the choice not to grow cows or various other things, and then they can have the ability potentially for having a little bit of that storage from the winter flows to grow something that's not going to have such an effect on the carbon. So, we're trying to, our goal was to be a net carbon emitter sequester. And I think most farmers, if they have the ability to actually perhaps store a bit of water, do something different on a portion of their land, they may easily be able to meet that without having some, who knows what the punitive charges will be in the future, but I should imagine they will be reasonably high.
Thank you very much.
One more question.
Mr Riddell, I'm just pondering over your numbers of stock. Would you be one of the larger, would you have one of the larger numbers of stock in the tank catchments?
No. So up behind me is Kereroo Station, which is goes into the Poperangi River.
Yep.
Big Hill Station. And then if you go on the other side of the Narora, there's the Wanawana, Awapai, a number of similar size, if not bigger. Next door to me is a similar size property. They all do something a little bit differently. I probably have more cattle at the present time, but I'm forced to either be in cattle or sheep.
So their demand for stock water would be in the same ballpark as yours?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Riddell, and I've just noted the apologies also for Mr and Mrs Lawrence. We've got their detailed submission as well, so thank you very much for coming along.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for hearing me.
Do we have Mr Stuart McIntyre here? Not due for about another 50 minutes. J&S White Contracting at all? Big Hill Station? Oh, we're going to have another little break.